Community is about going the extra mile, doing more than what's expected. And at National Grid, we think doing more for our customers is important. That's why we offer a variety of services and solutions to make managing your bill easier. This includes energy-saving programs and rebates that can help you use less energy. National Grid, we're here for your home. Learn more at ngrid.com/hereforyou.
Before we get started with this week's episode, it's the last week of Climate Month here at CommonWealth Beacon, and we're closing it out with a live podcast in partnership with the Cape and Islands NPR station, CAI. It is at Provincetown Town Hall on the evening of April 30th, which is a Wednesday, and registration is not required, but it is appreciated. Hope to see you there, and on to the episode. Higher education has had the shift toward green technology and green jobs in sight for years, especially in states like Massachusetts, where officials have leaned into resilience and clean energy, set goals for carbon neutrality, and tried to consider the climate impact for most government initiatives. But those goals, and many of the underlying principles of higher education, are under threat from the Trump administration, which is aggressively trying to roll back grant funding for the sciences. And of course, higher education has been roiled by immigration actions snapping up foreign students, even off the streets of Massachusetts, and even if they've been charged with no crimes. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. I talked with President of the UMass system, Marty Meehan, on Tuesday. If you have yet to listen to the episode of the Codcast with Massachusetts Commissioner of Higher Education, Noe Ortega, earlier this year, I think these two conversations work well together, so feel free to pop back into the archives. Much of the focus on higher ed right now is, for good reason, on how private institutions like Harvard are engaging or pushing back on federal demands, with Harvard University's lawsuit against the Trump administration filed last week. But there's plenty to dig into on the state systems as well. Since our conversation, the administration has taken further aim at education with a series of executive orders aiming to shift the ideological tilt of higher education. But for now, my conversation with President Meehan. President Meehan, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So for those who want to go point by point through your State of the University address, we will link to the transcript and video in the show notes. But its major focus was on climate tech investment, which is timely because it's Climate Month. This is the, I guess, in case you're new here section, very briefly. Climate tech is, broadly speaking, technologies and services that enable decarbonization of the global economy. So, how has the UMass system approached climate tech in recent years?
From my vantage point, as the state's public research university, I think that UMass is uniquely positioned to take a leadership role in something that I think is a critically important area, which is climate tech. And I'm committed to a kind of a whole university approach to make our campuses and our economic and our research partners on all 5 of our campuses partners with the state. We already have work going on many of our campuses. At UMass Lowell, for example, we've launched a clean energy environmental legacy transition, which we call the CELT initiative, which stems from a partnership with UMass and universities in Ireland. All of our campuses are engaged in research relative to climate change. At UMass Amherst, for example, we have researchers at the Water and Energy Technology Center, which is we call the WET Labs, and they test new technologies in water treatment and purification to combat future water challenges. And we have living seawalls, for example, at UMass Boston. So all our campuses are engaged and involved in climate research. But, I think in many ways, the private sector is going to get into this and really make a huge difference. I want to make sure that UMass is doing everything we can to partner with the Healy Driscoll administration. And, they've passed the Mass Leads Act, which provides $1.4 billion in state funding to support climate change technology. And I think the development of that technology is important. And the goal here really is to accelerate the Commonwealth's effort to make sure that we're in a great position to establish the state as a climate tech hub.
So now this does seem to be in conflict in some places with the federal government's position on green energy and climate tech. The president's budget would eviscerate weather and climate research. So how is UMass positioned here?
I think on climate tech, green technology, we have an obligation as a public research university to work with our governor, who has laid out a very aggressive, nationally significant state policy on climate tech, and that's our responsibility to do that. I think the fact that many other states in the country are not doing this, many of their actions in climate tech may be frozen. This is an opportunity, I think, for Massachusetts to show national leadership. And I think the fact that the federal government may not be as interested as they were under a previous administration, that makes our responsibility, I think, even greater to step into the role and make climate tech a priority and to make Massachusetts a leader globally.
So, two projects from your State of the University speech, one of which you mentioned was about living seawalls. Another one was development of ocean-safe plastics. Not sure how that would be taken, given the administration is heated about plastic straws right now for some reason. So my question here is essentially, given that, how predictable are the federal targets here? There's rollbacks of maps and data that, for instance, make it possible to predict where erosion might happen, which might tell you where those kind of living seawalls would be useful. So how much of a bead do you think you have and UMass has on where they need to be shoring up against the federal government versus where there might be some alignment?
Well, I think right now the federal government's role is extremely unpredictable. In fact, I would go a step further and say everything that the federal government is doing right now is unpredictable. That's why I think our focus needs to be on the state, the private sector, and our global partners. The private sector is going to go a long way toward determining what's going to happen in climate tech. And we've seen massive investments in private sector dollars. So from my vantage point, it's uncertain or unclear what the federal government is doing. But I can tell you this, if you look at the private investment globally, it's nearly $1 trillion. So the private sector is investing in climate tech. And so I think, the fact that the federal government may get behind a few years, that's their issue, but I don't think it should be Massachusetts' issue.
For those who could use a quick primer here, so the UMass system is funded through a combination of state support, student revenue, and nearly $1 billion in federal funding through a few major channels here. And federal cuts to research funding have already had an impact inside the UMass system. What comes to mind, of course, is several dozen applicants to the Morningside Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at UMass Chan, who had provisional offers for fall 2025, had those offers rescinded because of this loss of grant funding. So let's take this one area at a time. How would you describe the level of threat that the Trump administration poses to the UMass system financially?
Well, let's first of all start with NIH funding. The University of Massachusetts receives approximately $285 million in NIH funding. That funding is important for the quality of healthcare, our ability to help cure diseases, and it's really important research. But for us at the university, if they cut back on how much they'll pay for facilities and administrative costs, that obviously is going to hurt the university to the tune, in this case, of about $93 million. Now, we have the Attorney General of Massachusetts has gone into court, and they have stopped the federal government from implementing these cuts so far. But obviously, there are going to be cuts in federal spending. In terms of so that's one area. To go to another area, we receive significant investment from the federal government for Pell Grants and for student loans. They are administered presently out of the Department of Education. Could they administer those programs, the Pell Grant program and student loans? yeah, they could administer it, I suppose, someplace else. I'm not sure. We have to make sure that there's expertise. You have to understand how financial aid works in order to make sure that students get their Pell Grants on time, to make sure they get their student loans on time. But I'm worried about that. And traditionally, just as in research, grants for students and loans for students have always had bipartisan support in the Congress. So I'm hoping that there will be bipartisan support to say we need to make sure that a college education, whether it's public or private, is accessible to as many people as possible. From my vantage point, the federal government needs to maintain that commitment to financial aid, both in terms of loans, but also the Pell Grant.
There have been a number of recent initiatives around tuition in the UMass system and in Massachusetts generally. There is, of course, the program offering free tuition to those whose families make less than $75,000 a year. There is also, and this is kind of tied into another major issue around the Trump administration, is allowing in-state tuition regardless of the immigration status of students if they meet certain conditions, which has been something that several chancellors have pushed for. So what kind of risk, if any, are you seeing to those sorts of initiatives that we're sort of depending on having enough funding to be able to offer those programs?
Well, let me first say what we have done at UMass. Since I became president of the UMass system, we have increased by almost 80% the amount of money that we put into need-based financial aid. This year, it's a record $422 million. That financial aid, it's need-based. It goes to students, primarily in-state students, and that has allowed us to be in a position to offer free tuition to any family with income of $75,000 or below. On a per-student basis, UMass generated financial aid has grown almost twice as fast as net tuition revenue. So on average, our in-state undergraduate student pays less than $6,000 per year for tuition and mandatory costs. Now, I want to repeat that. Our average in-state undergraduate pays less than $6,000 per year for tuition and mandatory costs. In fact, more than one-third of our state undergraduate students attend tuition-free to the University of Massachusetts. So we have made need-based student aid a priority. Now, it also helps that they get federal Pell Grants. It also helps that when the federal government plays a role in loans. But we're going to continue to make that kind of a commitment to our students because I think, first of all, the sticker price of UMass isn't too high. What we like to do is get to a point where those students who need it get the financial aid that they need. The fact of the matter is, if you have more than one-third of in-state undergraduate students that attend UMass for free tuition, that's a pretty significant financial aid.
Well, so how much of the longevity of UMass's financing is possibly going to be dependent on the allocation of fair share funding or millionaire's tax funding, the surtax on those over a certain income that last budget cycle was directed quite profoundly toward education, and at least in the House proposal this year is more directed toward transportation? Where are the renewable sources of revenue that you're trying to keep an eye on?
Well, from our perspective, many of these are one-time cost. The governor has made a proposal to spend a huge amount of money over a period of 10 years on capital, which is actually was part of my State of the University address, is that that capital expenditure, which would come from fair share, would allow us to update our energy, to become more efficient, to get closer to having energy efficient buildings. If you look at our UMass buildings, most of them were built 50 or more years ago. We're one of the state's biggest users of energy. So if we could get that kind of a commitment from the fair share amendment, that results in the state investing in an area that, frankly, they should have invested over the last 3 decades, and that is updating our buildings. And the BRIGHT Act, I think, would be a great opportunity for the state to say, all right, we're going to make public higher education buildings more energy efficient. And, frankly, I support and applaud the governor for for her leadership in proposing this. I think the Bright Act is important to the future, not just of UMass, but all of public higher education in Massachusetts.
The financial side is also tied into the philosophical side of the federal government's actions here. We've talked often about the way that the Massachusetts economy and its educational economy depends on foreign students coming in, choosing to kind of exercise their mental efforts here in Massachusetts. We have seen a number of incidents recently in which foreign students might not feel safe coming to the state to study. What is the impact there in planning for the way that the student bodies look going forward?
Well, first of all, I think diversity makes university great. When I talk about diversity, I mean students from in the state of Massachusetts, out of state, people come in from other countries. So we have always strived to have a diverse set of students that come from everywhere. And there's no question that the federal government policies will hurt the effort to attract students from around the world. And I think we're going to see many of our universities here. I was recently in Ireland and in London talking to other universities who are telling me that they believe that they have an opportunity to attract a lot of students that would regularly come to the United States, because the higher education system in the United States is still the envy of the world. And so they feel that they're going to be able to pick up a lot of our students. But I will say that we had the most diverse class at UMass in the fall. Massachusetts has long benefited for our immigrants and our international students. Every time I see the governor, she says UMass has to bring even more people in to Massachusetts from outside of Massachusetts, because Massachusetts needs the talent. Massachusetts needs the people. So I think any loss of federal funding, it doesn't impact just UMass. It impacts our competitiveness as a country. It impacts our ability to cure cancer, our ability to find a cure to Alzheimer's. There's so much at stake that really goes beyond the University of Massachusetts, in my view.
Yesterday, you were one of, I think, hundreds of university leaders that signed a letter coordinated by the American Association of Colleges and Universities condemning the, and I'll quote, unprecedented government overreach and political interference now endangering American higher education. What was the thinking there? Where did that arise from? Was it because of the Columbia and Harvard responses to the Trump administration?
I think it comes from the fact that research in America is under attack, and I had an opportunity to serve for 14 years in the Congress, and research in the United States has always enjoyed bipartisan support, and it has been a partnership between the federal government and public and private research universities around the country. I think it's important for us at this point in time to stand together on behalf of our students and what has made, as I said earlier, American higher education is the envy of the world. And I think it's important, if we're under attack, that we need to stand together and say this unprecedented attacks on higher education need to stop. And, I'm all for the federal government or state government asking us to look at ways to improve. I'm all for increasing return on investment that our students in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts make. I'm all for finding a way to make sure more people graduate, more students graduate on time. And so I'm constantly looking for ways to improve the University of Massachusetts. But I think the federal government controlling higher education, particularly private institutions, it's unprecedented. And I think it's important that all university leaders stand together on this issue.
How have university leaders been approaching the sort of united front logic? Because we've seen it a number of points in the past year or so, whether kind of coming before Congress on the issue of student protests or recently around the Trump administration's kind of threats to pull grants or other sources of funding, that it's been a little bit ad hoc here or there. So what's the kind of structural use of a united front?
My priority, frankly and candidly, is to make sure day in and day out we are doing everything we can to protect our students, to support our students. If there are protests on campuses, we want to make sure that students are safe, whether they be, Jewish students, Palestinian students, Israeli students. So being a university president or chancellor today is a big job and it's a tough job. So my focus is primarily on making sure that we're doing everything we can to get through a difficult period to have our students be successful. So I would say that's more of a focus for me is what can we do for the students at the University of Massachusetts to make sure that they graduate on time, to make sure that they're safe, to make sure they're getting the best quality education they can get at an affordable price. So honestly, that's really where my focus is.
As university president, where do you draw red lines, so to speak? I'm not going to define that because I'm kind of interested in your definition here. And how able do you feel to hold those lines?
Look, I think my job is to work with the state government, regardless of who's governor, whether they be Democrat or Republican, and also to work with the federal government wherever we can, particularly if it helps our students. So I'll continue to do that. I've called and talked to members of Congress, both Democratic and Republican, to try to get support for what universities are trying to do, to try to get support for the research that we're doing at the University of Massachusetts. I don't have a red line per se. I try to do what's right day in and day out. But I do think that the independence of universities is important. We at UMass have a governance structure where our board of trustees is independent from the rest of higher education and the rest of state government. I think our independence as a university is one of the reasons why we're the only sector of public higher education in Massachusetts where all our campuses are nationally ranked. So I think independence in higher education is important. We need to be focused on what's best for our students, how we can better serve our students. And sometimes that means being focused in an independent way.
And so we've talked about kind of the entire campus system, but in the same way that, private and public universities are positioned a little bit differently in terms of what they get from the federal government, what they can kind of support on their own here. The different campuses are also positioned differently. Threats to research funding might be felt more at one campus than another, depending on those grants. So is there anything that's stood out to you in recent months about the ways that certain campuses are or aren't able to weather some of these threats?
Well, if you look at the National Institute of Health, we get most of our funding for the NIH at the medical school and at the Amherst campus. And as I said, we could potentially lose $93 million in facilities costs that NIH has committed to pay the university. So in that particular instance, it impacts the medical school and UMass Amherst more. There are other instances where there's technology funding or Department of Defense funding that might affect the Lowell campus more. So it depends upon what kind of funding we're talking about. I can tell you that Pell Grants and need-based financial aid, that affects every campus. UMass Boston is 50% Pell eligible. UMass Dartmouth is 40% Pell eligible. UMass Lowell is 37% or so. And so all of our campuses are affected by whether or not the federal government is going to make the commitment that they've made, for years and years and years, and that is a commitment to Pell Grant and need-based financial aid.
And you mentioned, of course, your time in Congress. Did you get out of there at the right time? Are you sad that you're not in there right now, having these fights kind of face to face to whatever extent you did?
Well, I'm not envious of my former colleagues, but I have my hands full at the University of Massachusetts. I will say that I'm extremely appreciative of the fact that there are good people willing to serve in Congress, and I've had many meetings and conversations with members of our congressional delegation. I've been in constant contact, for example, with Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Richie Neal and other members of the delegation. We met as all the chancellors met with the delegation recently. So I'm appreciative of those who are willing to serve, but I'm not wishing I was back there, no.
Does it feel unpredictable, not just what's coming from the Trump administration specifically, but the reason that Congress has come up so much for so many people is the sense that it is sort of willingly ceded some of the powers that it usually exercises. So thinking about that funding, which you've noted is something that historically many Congresspeople have agreed on, but they're not the ones specifically withholding it until recently. How has that been striking you?
I think one of the things we do or I do at the University of Massachusetts is I'm associated with national organizations such as the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, the National University of System Heads. And so I'm working within those organizations with university presidents and chancellors that are from red states, and we're developing strategies to try to make sure that people know that of the importance of research universities, the importance of the job that we do in terms of educating students, particularly those students from disadvantaged backgrounds that need the opportunity, as I got, to go to college and achieve their full potential. But yeah, we're working everyone we can possibly work, and I think while there is unpredictability right now, I think ultimately that the country will see the importance of public research universities and the important role they play in boosting the economy and the competitiveness of our country.
I think the thing that really is interesting to me right now is what the decision-making process looks like when you're trying to make those hard cuts, when you're thinking about what it means to be rescinding offers, how the system is approaching that value balance. Because unfortunately, if there's not an infinite amount of money or not a reliable funding source, you can't keep everything. So how do you decide what to do?
We've been making decisions like that at the University of Massachusetts for a long time. We've never been a university that was particularly well funded historically by the state. And one of the reasons why Moody's and S&P, they give us great ratings because of the fact that we manage ourselves really, really well. Now, Moody's recently downgraded the entire sector from stable to negative. So this is a difficult time across the board for the whole higher education sector. But I can tell you, we went through a terrible national crisis with COVID-19, and it presented enormous pressures on the University of Massachusetts. We needed to make difficult cuts, and we made them. And we made them based on what we felt was right for the university, and the individual chancellors make those decisions, and they're making those decisions now. Many of those decisions are unfortunate, and we hope that as the country renews its commitment to research, that we'll be able to adjust those decisions in the future. But it's really important that the University of Massachusetts be run well, and so we have to make difficult decisions. But we've had to in times of recession, we've had to in the crisis of COVID, and we have to in these difficult times as well. But I can tell you this: long term, the University of Massachusetts will be financially strong, and will do all of this with what's in the best interest of our students, short term, but also long term.
And have you felt that the university system was adequately prepared for this possibility? When I was preparing for this, it seemed clear that there were maybe three main angles of attack from the Trump administration. One of them is, of course, kind of climate and science policy, which we've talked about. One is DEI, especially given the recent ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court on affirmative action policies. And the third is kind of taking aim at the dynamics that came up around those campus protests. So I think the last thing that I'm curious about is, to what extent do you think that the universities understood that their posture on that in the past few years on these areas might kind of offer an opportunity to an administration inclined to kind of use those as wedge points?
So before the election was even held, before the election, I established at the University of Massachusetts a task force on research, a task force on DEI and diversity. And we began looking at all of these issues and preparing in advance of the election. We established a task force on immigration because we knew that there was probably going to be threats to our very diverse student population. So all three of those task force got to work beforehand. They're developing strategy. They have been studying state law. They've been studying federal changes in the law so that the university is in the best possible position to react to whatever challenges we have to react to. And to be honest with you, I think we were pretty well prepared, given the fact that we established these task force before the before the election, and we were anticipating that there could be attacks in this area. You mentioned the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, which, frankly, I didn't agree with, but I did read the decision, and it was a well-written decision, and we implemented that decision at UMass. We made sure that we looked at what we could do and what we couldn't do. And at the end of the day, we have our most diverse class ever at UMass Amherst. We have our most diverse class ever at our law school, and the university as a whole had its most diverse class this year than we ever had. So I like to work with whatever I need to work with. And we had a Supreme Court decision. We needed to follow the Supreme Court decision. And even though we maybe a lot of us didn't agree with it, but at the end of the day, we instituted policies that were constitutional and where we got our result, and that we continue to become a more diverse university.
And I think the last question is, speaking of those sorts of benchmarks and bellwethers, as you're having these discussions with your peers across the country, what are the kind of public university systems watching right now that might be different from the way that the privates are thinking about it?
Well, I would say financial aid, Pell Grants, making sure, public research universities in America educate the vast majority of people in the country. And our economy needs to have highly skilled folks that graduate from our public research universities that keep the economy of the country going strong. So I think making sure that we have the financial aid and the assistance from state and federal governments to make sure we're affordable to everyone. The great thing about land-grant universities, and the reason why Justin Morrill, who was a congressman from Vermont, and Abraham Lincoln signed this bill into law, was because, in 1863, before it was signed into law, the only people that got a college education were rich and elite. And there was really a need to get the average person in the country to get educated. And the result of that has been an enormous economic boom in the country since that legislation passed. The other thing I would say is that UMass is critically important to the Massachusetts economy. 75% of our students stay in Massachusetts. We literally educate the workforce of Massachusetts, and we're an innovation economy. And an innovation economy needs highly skilled people to take jobs. And UMass, that's a job that UMass does and has been doing for over 160 years. So that's critically important to the Massachusetts economy. It's also important to the competitiveness in the national economy as well.
Well, thanks again to President Marty Meehan for joining me on the podcast. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We will be back next week.